The rhythmic sounds of Trauma Bay 1 were a language Elena Rostova spoke fluently. It was a symphony of controlled panic. The hiss of the ventilators sounded like measured breathing. The sharp, erratic beeps of the cardiac monitors were the pulse of the room. The heavy, antiseptic smell of bleach and iodine hung in the air, a chemical veil trying to mask the metallic scent of fresh blood. Elena moved through the space with a calculated glide. Her rubber-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the polished linoleum floor. She kept her eyes downcast, her posture deliberately curved inward, making herself smaller than she actually was. It was a masterclass in invisibility. She was just a trauma nurse to the rest of the staff at the Metropolitan Veterans Hospital. A quiet, unassuming woman who never spoke out of turn and always did exactly what she was told. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was safe. Invisibility meant no one asked questions about the faint white scars that laced across her knuckles. It meant no one noticed the way she instinctively mapped the exits every time she entered a new room. It meant no one paid attention to the way she balanced her weight on the balls of her feet, always ready to move, always ready to strike. Today, however, invisibility was proving difficult. A dark, angry bruise bloomed across her left cheekbone. It was a mottled canvas of purple and yellow, stark against her pale skin. She kept her dark hair pulled forward, trying to shadow her face as she restocked the intubation trays. She had acquired the bruise 3 nights ago. A combative patient suffering from severe night terrors had lashed out wildly in the dark ward. Elena could have easily redirected the man's momentum. She could have pinned him to the mattress in a fraction of a second using a joint lock she had perfected in a dusty compound half a world away. But doing so would have raised questions. Nurses did not move like Tier 1 operators. Nurses did not possess the muscle memory of a seasoned combatant. So she had made a choice. She had deliberately taken the hit. She had let the heavy fist connect with her face, absorbing the impact, playing the role of the fragile civilian. It was a small price to pay to keep her ghost quiet. The heavy double doors of the trauma bay swung open, hitting the magnetic stops with a loud, aggressive crack. Dr. Aris Thorne strode into the room. He did not walk, he paraded. Thorne was the chief of trauma, a man who wore his authority like a brightly colored uniform. He was loud, verbose, and perpetually condescending. His white coat was immaculately pressed, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the floor, demanding attention. He was a man who believed that volume equated to competence. He was a paper tiger who had never seen a real fire. "Let us get this space organized, people," Thorne barked, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. He clapped his hands together, a sharp, unnecessary sound. "I want the central line kits prepped, and I want the ultrasound machine ready at the head of the bed." He did not look at the nurses as he spoke. He spoke to the air, expecting the environment to simply mold itself to his will. Elena continued restocking the tray, her hands moving with fluid, mechanical precision. She had already prepped the central line kits 20 minutes ago. She had already calibrated the ultrasound. "Nurse Rostova," Thorne snapped, finally locking his gaze on her. Elena paused, keeping her head slightly bowed. "Yes, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice soft, devoid of any inflection. "Are you listening to me or simply staring at the gauze?" he asked, a sneer playing on his lips. "The kits are prepped, doctor," she replied evenly. Thorne scoffed, stepping closer to her. He was a tall man, and he used his height to intimidate, looming over the nursing staff. He noticed the dark swelling on her cheek. "What happened to your face?" he asked, not out of concern, but out of distaste. "An accident, doctor," Elena said quietly. "Well, try to keep your hair over it," Thorne commanded dismissively. "It is unprofessional. We have high-profile patients transferring in from the highway pileup today." "Yes, doctor," Elena said, stepping back, creating distance. She felt the familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was not fear, it was the suppression of a deeply ingrained instinct to neutralize a threat. She forced her breathing to remain shallow and even. She pushed the ghost of Valkyrie further down into the dark recesses of her mind. Across the bay, Maggie caught Elena's eye. Maggie was the senior charge nurse, a woman with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Maggie had been working trauma for 30 years. She had seen every type of ego that walked through the hospital doors. More importantly, Maggie saw Elena. She saw past the quiet demeanor and the curved posture. Maggie gave Elena a subtle, tight-lipped nod. It was a silent message of solidarity, a warning to keep her head down and let the storm pass. Elena returned the nod, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled to life. The harsh, electronic tone of the trauma alert system pierced the air. Code red, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes. Mass casualty incident. Incoming VIP convoy transport. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The controlled panic escalated into a frantic electric tension. Thorne's posture stiffened. He smoothed the lapels of his white coat, a nervous tic masquerading as preparation. "All right, listen up," Thorne announced loudly, his voice rising an octave. "This is a high-visibility case. I want absolute adherence to protocol." He pointed a manicured finger at the junior resident who was visibly trembling. "You will handle the airway. Do not deviate from the standard algorithm." He turned his gaze back to Elena. "Rostova, you stay on the periphery. Fetch what I need. Do not get in my way." "Understood," Elena said. She retreated to the back wall, near the supply carts. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She visualized the room. She mapped the placement of the defibrillator, the chest tube trays, the emergency blood supply. Her heart rate counterintuitively began to drop. While the rest of the room accelerated into a frenzy, Elena's internal metronome slowed down. It was the training. It was the cold, hard conditioning of a life she had left behind. When the chaos peaked, the operator found the silence. The heavy double doors crashed open again. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a blood-stained gurney. The rhythmic squeak of the wheels was drowned out by a cacophony of shouting voices. 55-year-old male, involved in a high-speed convoy collision, the lead paramedic yelled over the din. Blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. Blood pressure is tanking, 80/40. Heart rate is 140. He is fading fast. The patient was transferred from the gurney to the trauma bed with a synchronized heave. Elena watched from the shadows. The man on the bed was gray, his skin slick with a cold sweat. His chest heaved violently, fighting for every shallow breath. He wore the remnants of a military dress uniform, the fabric shredded and soaked in dark arterial red. Thorne stepped to the side of the bed, his face pale. He looked at the monitor, then at the patient, then back at the monitor. His eyes were darting rapidly. He was processing the information, but he was not synthesizing it. He was relying on a textbook that was rapidly burning in the face of unscripted reality. "He is in shock," Thorne declared loudly, stating the obvious. "Start massive transfusion protocol. Hang 2 units of O negative." Maggie was already moving, hanging the heavy bags of blood, squeezing them to force the fluid into the man's veins. "Doctor, his breath sounds are absent on the right side," the junior resident stammered, pulling his stethoscope away from the patient's chest. Thorne's jaw clenched. "Tension pneumothorax," Thorne declared, his voice tight with rising panic. "He needs a chest tube right now. Prep the right lateral side." From her position by the wall, Elena narrowed her eyes. She looked at the patient's neck. The jugular veins were completely flat. She looked at the trachea. It was perfectly midline. There was no deviation. A tension pneumothorax would present with distended neck veins and a shifted trachea. This was not air trapping in the chest. This was an exsanguinating hemorrhage. The man was bleeding to death internally, likely from a ruptured spleen or a torn inferior vena cava. Putting a chest tube in now would waste critical time and potentially drop his blood pressure to 0. Elena stepped forward, breaking her own rule of invisibility. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and carrying over the noise. Thorne ignored her, grabbing a scalpel from the tray. "Dr. Thorne," Elena repeated, stepping closer to the bed. "Look at his neck. His veins are flat. The trachea is midline." Thorne froze, the scalpel hovering over the patient's ribs. He turned his head slowly, glaring at Elena with pure venom. "Are you questioning my diagnosis, nurse?" he hissed. "I am observing the clinical signs, doctor," Elena replied, her tone neutral but firm. "He is hypovolemic, not obstructive. He needs immediate surgical control of the bleeding, not a chest tube." Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He felt his authority being challenged in a room full of subordinates. His ego, fragile and inflated, took over completely. "You will step back, Rostova," Thorn commanded, his voice shaking with rage. You are a nurse. You fetch supplies. I am the chief of trauma. I make the decisions. He pointed the scalpel at her. Step back to the wall before I have you removed from this hospital. Elena held his gaze for a long second. She saw the fear in his eyes. She saw a man who was terrified of being wrong, and therefore incapable of being right. She stepped back. She retreated to the shadows. She had tried the civilian way. She had tried to use the chain of command. Maggie shot Elena a desperate look across the bed. Maggie knew Elena was right, but Maggie also knew the rigid hierarchy of the hospital. A nurse did not physically stop a doctor from cutting. The doors to the trauma bay opened again, this time admitting a wall of military brass. 3 men in crisp uniforms stepped into the room, their presence heavy and demanding. At the front was General Vance. He was a man carved from granite, with silver hair and eyes like chipped ice. He wore 3 stars on his collar. He surveyed the chaotic room with the calm, calculating gaze of a battlefield commander. "What is his status?" General Vance demanded, his voice a low rumble that cut through the noise. Thorn jumped, visibly startled by the general's sudden appearance. He immediately puffed out his chest, trying to project a confidence he did not possess. "General," Thorn said, his voice overly loud, "we are managing a severe tension pneumothorax. I am about to insert a chest tube to relieve the pressure." General Vance stepped closer to the foot of the bed. He looked at the dying man, then looked sharply at Thorn. "Then do it, doctor," Vance said coldly. "Stop talking and do it." Thorn swallowed hard. His hands were visibly shaking. He pressed the scalpel against the patient's skin between the ribs. He made the incision. Blood trickled out, but there was no rush of air. There was no hiss of a relieved tension pneumothorax. Thorn pushed the heavy plastic tube into the chest cavity. Nothing happened. The patient's condition did not improve. In fact, the monitor began to scream a new, terrifying alarm. The shrill, continuous tone of a dropping heart rate. "Heart rate is plummeting," the resident yelled. 40 beats per minute, 30. "Blood pressure is unreadable." Thorn stared at the chest tube in disbelief. "That is impossible," he muttered, his voice cracking. "The protocol says—" He trailed off, his mind blanking. The protocol had failed him. The script had ended, and he was lost in the wilderness of a real crisis. "Doctor, he's crashing," Maggie shouted, slamming another bag of blood onto the rapid infuser. "We are losing him." Thorn looked around wildly. He looked at the resident. He looked at Maggie. He looked at General Vance, whose face was hardening into a mask of pure fury. The paper tiger was catching fire. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," Thorn stuttered, throwing out a standard cardiac arrest order. Elena's jaw clenched. Epinephrine would squeeze the remaining blood out of the patient's peripheral vessels, accelerating the bleeding in his core. It was a death sentence. The monitor tone flatlined, a solid, continuous, high-pitched scream. "He is in VFib," the resident yelled. Panic erupted. The room dissolved into absolute, unmitigated chaos. People were shouting over each other. The resident was fumbling with the defibrillator pads. Thorn stepped backward, bumping into a Mayo stand, sending a tray of surgical instruments crashing to the floor. The metallic clatter sounded like a bomb going off. Thorn stared at his hands. They were covered in the patient's blood. He was hyperventilating. He had completely frozen. He was paralyzed by the magnitude of his own failure. Seconds ticked by. Each second was a drop of life draining from the man on the bed. General Vance stepped forward, grabbing Thorn by the shoulder of his immaculate white coat. "Do something," the general roared. Thorn just whimpered, shaking his head. He was broken. From the shadows by the wall, Elena watched the system fail. She watched the hierarchy collapse. She watched a man die because of a title and a fragile ego. The coldness in her stomach spread to her chest, up her spine, and into her mind. The hospital room faded away. The smell of bleach was replaced by the phantom scent of cordite and hot sand. The shrill alarm of the monitor morphed into the whine of incoming mortar fire. She was no longer Nurse Rostova. The switch flipped. The heavy, dark door she kept locked inside her mind swung wide open. Valkyrie woke up. Elena moved. She did not walk. She exploded across the room with terrifying, lethal speed. She closed the distance to the trauma bed in 3 massive, silent strides. She did not ask for permission. She did not observe the chain of command. She hit Dr. Thorne with her shoulder. It was a calculated, forceful strike that sent the tall man stumbling backward until he crashed hard against the far wall. "Move," Elena commanded. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was low, hard, and imbued with an unshakable, absolute authority. It was a voice that had commanded men under heavy fire. It was a voice that did not ask. It dictated reality. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence, broken only by the screaming flatline monitor. Everyone froze, staring at the quiet nurse who had just physically assaulted the chief of trauma. Elena ignored them all. She stepped into the space Thorne had vacated. She looked down at the dying man. Her hands, previously hidden in the pockets of her scrubs, were now moving with blinding speed. "Maggie, scalpel, 10 blade, now," Elena barked, not looking up. Maggie, operating on pure instinct and 30 years of recognizing true competence, slapped the scalpel into Elena's outstretched palm. "Resident," Elena snapped, her eyes locked on the patient's chest. "Drop the paddles. He is empty. You cannot shock an empty heart. Get on the rapid infuser and run it wide open." The resident, terrified by the sudden shift in power, instantly obeyed. Elena did not hesitate. She placed the scalpel against the left side of the patient's chest, tracing the line of the fourth intercostal space. She was performing a resuscitative thoracotomy. It was a brutal, desperate procedure. Cracking the chest open to manually pump the heart and clamp the descending aorta. It was something only highly specialized trauma surgeons attempted. It was something Tier 1 special operations medics did in the dirt to keep their teammates alive until extraction. Elena pressed down. She made a deep, sweeping incision from the sternum to the armpit. Blood welled up instantly, dark and sluggish. "Rib spreaders," she commanded. Maggie handed her the heavy, stainless steel retractor. Elena inserted the blades into the incision. She cranked the handle with immense physical strength. The sound of ribs separating and snapping echoed loudly in the silent room. It was a brutal, sickening crunch. General Vance took a step back, his eyes widening in shock. Dr. Thorne, still slumped against the wall, watched with his mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Elena plunged her bare hands into the open chest cavity. The heat of the man's internal organs radiated against her skin. She bypassed the lungs, pushing them aside. She found the pericardial sac. It was intact, not filled with blood. Her diagnosis was confirmed. The bleeding was lower. She reached deeper, sliding her hand down past the diaphragm. She was operating blind, relying entirely on touch and a profound, intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Her fingers searched through the sleek darkness. She felt the massive, pulsating tube of the descending aorta. She felt the tear, a jagged laceration pouring life into the abdominal cavity. "Found it," she muttered, her voice tight with exertion. "Aortic tear, clamping it." She did not ask for a surgical clamp. There was no time. She used her fingers. She pinched the massive artery shut, squeezing with every ounce of strength in her hand, cutting off the blood supply to the lower half of the body. She diverted all remaining blood directly to the brain and the heart. "Cardiac massage," she announced. With her left hand, she reached up and grasped the flaccid muscle of the patient's heart. She began to squeeze, rhythmically, forcefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. She became the man's pulse. She became his life support. "Maggie, push 2 units of whole blood directly into the central line," Elena ordered, her eyes fixed on the empty space above the bed, concentrating entirely on the feeling in her hands. "Resident, push 1 amp of bicarb and 1 amp of calcium." The room was a flurry of synchronized action, all orbiting around the epicenter of Elena's calm command. Maggie moved like lightning, injecting the medications and hanging the blood. Elena continued to pump the heart. Her forearm muscles burned. Her face was set in a mask of absolute, terrifying focus. The bruise on her cheek seemed to darken against her pale skin, a testament to the violence she understood so well. 30 seconds passed, an eternity in a trauma room. Then, Elena felt it. A flutter against her left palm, a weak, erratic twitch, then a stronger beat. The heart was trying to start. "He is fibrillating," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "Internal pedals, now." Maggie slapped the sterile internal defibrillator pedals into Elena's hands. Elena placed the small metal spoons directly against the raw muscle of the heart. "Charge to 20 joules," she ordered. The machine whined, a high-pitched building of energy. "Clear," Elena commanded. Everyone stepped back from the bed. Elena pressed the button on the pedals. The patient's chest convulsed slightly. Elena looked at the monitor. The flat line broke. A jagged, chaotic wave appeared. Then another. Then a slow, wide, regular spike. "Beep, beep, beep. Sinus rhythm," the resident whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "We have a pulse. Blood pressure is coming up. 60/40. Elena did not relax. She kept her right hand clamped tightly on the aorta inside the chest cavity. "Call the OR," Elena ordered, looking directly at the resident. "Tell them we are coming up immediately with an open chest and a clamped descending aorta. Tell Dr. Harris to scrub in, no one else." The resident nodded furiously and bolted for the wall phone. Elena stood perfectly still, her hand buried in the patient's chest, holding the line between life and death. Her breathing was slow and measured. The crisis was managed. The chaos was broken. The silence returned to the room, heavy and thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. Dr. Thorne slowly peeled himself off the wall. His face was ashen. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror, awe, and deep, profound humiliation. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert some form of dominance, to reclaim his shattered authority. "Nurse Rostova," Thorne stammered, his voice pathetic and weak. You had no right." General Vance stepped into Thorne's line of sight, completely blocking the doctor. The general did not look at Thorne. He looked only at Elena. He walked slowly around the trauma bed. He ignored the blood on the floor. He ignored the gaping wound in his officer's chest. He stopped 2 feet away from Elena. He studied her. He looked at the way she stood, perfectly balanced, her core engaged, bearing the physical strain of holding an artery closed without a single tremor in her arm. He looked at her eyes, cold, flat, and completely devoid of panic. Then the general looked at her face. He saw the dark, mottled bruise on her left cheekbone. He saw the faint white scars on her exposed knuckles. He saw the way her scrap sleeve had ridden up her forearm, revealing the edge of a faded black ink tattoo. A winged sword. The insignia of an elite, deeply classified medical rescue unit. General Vance's eyes widened slightly. A flicker of recognition, followed by a profound, deferential respect, crossed his hardened features. He leaned in close, ignoring the sterile field. His voice was barely a whisper, meant only for her ears. "Your Valkyrie?" he asked. Elena looked up at the general. She did not flinch. She did not drop her gaze. The ghost was out of the bottle, and there was no putting it back. "I was, sir," Elena replied quietly, her voice steady. General Vance nodded slowly. "I read the after-action reports from the Korengal Valley," the general said, his voice thick with emotion. "They said you had a severed femoral artery closed for 4 hours in the back of a burning transport under heavy fire. They said you saved 12 men that night. They also said you disappeared after your discharge." "I found a quiet place, General," Elena said, her grip on the aorta never wavering. "Apparently not quiet enough," Vance murmured, looking down at the stabilized patient. "You just saved my executive officer." The doors to the trauma bay swung open, and the transport team from the operating room rushed in with a specialized gurney. "We need to move him," Elena said, snapping back to the immediate reality. "I have to maintain this manual clamp until the vascular surgeon can take over in the OR." "Do it," General Vance commanded, stepping back to give them room. The team carefully transferred the patient, with Elena moving in perfect synchronization, her arm buried deep in the chest cavity, walking alongside the bed. As they reached the doors, General Vance turned his attention back to Dr. Thorne. Thorne was standing in the corner, a broken, trembling shell of a man. His expensive shoes were stained with blood, his white coat was rumpled, his arrogance had been systematically dismantled and destroyed in front of his staff and a 3-star general. "Dr. Thorne," General Vance said, his voice echoing in the emptying room. Thorne flinched. "Yes, General?" Thorne whispered. "You are a liability," Vance stated simply, his tone devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "Your reliance on your title almost cost a good man his life today. You froze. You panicked. You let your ego dictate medical care. Thorne opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. There was no defense. The reality of his incompetence was undeniable. "I will be speaking with the hospital administrator immediately," Vance continued. "You will not touch another patient in this facility while I am here. Is that understood?" Thorne swallowed hard, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Yes, General," Thorne mumbled. He turned and walked out of the trauma bay, a paper tiger reduced to ash. An hour later, Elena sat alone in the sterile, brightly lit locker room. The adrenaline had finally begun to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Her scrubs were soaked with blood. Her left arm ached with a dull, throbbing pain from the immense physical exertion of holding the artery. She stared at her hands. They were trembling slightly now, the aftermath of the cold focus. She had spent 3 years trying to bury Valkyrie. She had spent 3 years trying to be normal, trying to be invisible, trying to escape the memories of the sand and the blood. But today, she realized something fundamental. You cannot hide what you are. You cannot suppress radical competence. When the fire comes, the tiger either burns or it fights. The locker room door opened with a soft click. Maggie walked in. The senior charge nurse carried a fresh set of dark blue scrubs and a damp towel. Maggie did not say anything at first. She walked over to the bench and sat down next to Elena. She handed Elena the damp towel. Elena took it, wiping the dried blood from her forearms. "They are still talking about it up in the OR," Maggie said quietly, looking straight ahead at the metal lockers. "Dr. Harris said he had never seen anything like it. He said the clamp was perfect. He said you bought that man his life with your bare hands." Elena remained silent, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on her wrist. "I knew you were hiding something, Elena," Maggie continued, her voice gentle. "You were too quiet. You were too observant. You moved through the wards like a soldier clearing a room. I just didn't know how deep it went." Elena stopped wiping her hands. She looked at Maggie. "I was tired of the noise, Maggie," Elena whispered, her voice rough. "I was tired of the responsibility of holding lives in my hands. I just wanted to sweep floors and hand people bandages." Maggie turned to look at her, a sad smile playing on her lips. "The world doesn't let people like you sweep floors, Elena. When you have the gift of saving lives in the dark, you don't get to hide in the light." "Thorne is gone," Maggie added, changing the subject slightly. "Suspended pending a full review. The general made one phone call, and the administrator marched down here and took Thorne's badge." Elena felt a small, dark sense of vindication. It was not joy. It was simply the satisfaction of seeing the natural order restored, competence over volume, action over titles. The locker room door opened again. General Vance stood in the doorway. He had removed his uniform jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing his own faded scars. Maggie stood up respectfully. "I'll leave you two," Maggie said, squeezing Elena's shoulder before slipping out the door. General Vance walked into the room and leaned against the lockers. He looked at Elena, his expression softer now, stripped of the battlefield command. "He is stable," Vance said. "The surgeon grafted the aorta. He will wake up tomorrow." "Thank you, General," Elena said, staring at the floor. "Don't thank me, Valkyrie," Vance said softly. "You did the work." He crossed his arms over his chest. "I spoke with the hospital director," Vance continued. "They are creating a new position. A dedicated trauma response coordinator. Someone who operates outside the standard hierarchy during a code red. Someone who dictates protocol rather than following a broken one." Elena looked up, her brow furrowed. "I am a nurse, General." "You are an elite operator who happens to wear scrubs," Vance corrected her instantly. "I want you in that role. I want you teaching these residents how to handle real chaos. I want you showing them what to do when the textbook burns." Elena looked down at her hands again. The trembling had stopped. She touched the bruise on her cheek. It still hurt, but it felt different now. It no longer felt like a mark of forced submission. It felt like a badge. "I don't know if I can go back to being that person full-time," Elena admitted quietly. "I don't want you to be the person from the valley," Vance said gently. "I want you to be the person you are right now. The woman who knows how to heal, but isn't afraid to fight when the devil walks into the room. He pushed off the lockers and walked toward the door. "Think about it, Elena," he said, using her real name for the first time. "The world needs quiet professionals. We have enough loud amateurs." The general left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Elena sat alone in the quiet. She took a deep breath. The smell of bleach and iodine returned to her senses. But it no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a battlefield she had finally claimed. Weeks later, the atmosphere in Trauma Bay 1 was fundamentally different. The rhythmic sounds of the monitors were the same. The hum of the ventilators was the same. But the tension was gone. The controlled panic had been replaced by a smooth, highly efficient machine. A new junior doctor stood at the head of the bed, nervously preparing for an incoming trauma. He was young, eager, and terrified of making a mistake. Elena stood beside him. She was not hiding in the shadows. She stood in the center of the room, her posture straight, her presence commanding but calm. She wore a different colored scrap top now, denoting her new role as trauma coordinator. Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows. The winged sword tattoo was clearly visible for anyone who cared to look. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint yellow shadow, a memory of the day the ghost returned. The double doors crashed open. The paramedics rushed in with a critical patient. The junior doctor froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening at the sight of the blood. Elena stepped closer to him. She did not yell, she did not bark orders. She placed a steady, calm hand on his shoulder. "Breathe, doctor," Elena said, her voice low and even. "Assess the airway. Look at the patient, not the monitor." The young doctor took a breath, his panic subsiding under her steadying influence. He nodded. "Airway is clear," he announced, moving with sudden purpose. Elena watched him work, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. She had stopped fighting her past. She had integrated the operator and the caregiver. She had learned that true strength does not need to announce itself with loud voices or expensive shoes. True strength is quiet. True strength is standing in the center of the storm and refusing to be moved. True strength is knowing exactly what you are capable of and choosing to use it only when it matters most. The bravest act is not hiding from the world. The bravest act is showing up as your whole, unfiltered self, scars and all. The system had been broken by arrogance, but it had been healed by a quiet professional. Valkyrie was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of her mind. She was right here, in the light, holding the line. And the line would not break again.